Picture a single log so massive that it takes 20 oxen to move it. Not 10, not 15. 20 animals, each weighing close to 2,000 pounds, their muscles straining against leather harnesses thick as a man's arm. The wooden wheels beneath this load stand 12 feet tall, taller than a two-story building's first floor, and the log itself weighs somewhere around 100 tons. This is not a tall tale. This is how America built itself before steam engines reached the forest. So we live in an age where a single diesel truck can haul 40 tons down a paved highway at 60 miles per hour. The driver sits in an air-conditioned cab, listening to the radio, barely aware of the weight behind him. But rewind 150 years, and you would find a very different scene in the forests of Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the Pacific Northwest. You would find men covered in mud and sawdust, speaking to animals in low voices, coaxing them forward one step at a time. You would hear the groan of wooden axles under impossible weight. You would smell pine pitch, ox sweat, and wood smoke, and you would witness something that seems almost impossible by modern standards. The movement of trees heavier than locomotives using nothing but animal muscle and human ingenuity. This is the story of how America moved its biggest trees before the machines came. And it is a story of men and animals whose names have been largely forgotten, but whose labor built the cities we live in today. To understand why oxen became the primary engine of American logging, you have to understand the trees themselves. The white pines of Michigan and Wisconsin in the 1850s and 1860s were unlike anything we see in forests today. These were ancient trees, some of them standing for 300 years before the first logger set eyes on them. A single white pine could reach heights of 200 feet, with trunks measuring 6 feet across at the base. When you felled one of these giants, you were not dealing with something you could simply roll onto a cart. A log cut from the base of such a tree might measure 40 feet long and weigh somewhere between 60 and 100 tons depending on water content. That is heavier than most fully loaded railroad cars of the era, heavier than some steam locomotives. Horses, the obvious choice for pulling heavy loads in settled areas, could not handle this work. A good draft horse weighs about a ton and can pull roughly its own weight under ideal conditions. But logging conditions were never ideal. The ground was uneven, covered in stumps and slash. There were no roads, only rough trails carved through the wilderness. And the loads were not balanced, not packaged, not optimized for transport. They were raw sections of tree, still oozing sap, still carrying the weight of centuries of growth. Horses panicked under these conditions. They were too smart, in a way. When a massive log began sliding downhill, when the weight shifted unexpectedly, horses would bolt. They would try to escape. And in those moments of panic, men died. Chains snapped, equipment shattered. Horses broke their legs and had to be shot where they fell. Oxen were different. An ox is a castrated bull, trained from youth to work in harness. Where a horse is quick and nervous, an ox is slow and steady. Where a horse will fight against a load it cannot move, an ox will lean into it, applying constant pressure until something gives. And when things go wrong, when a log shifts, or a wheel breaks, or the ground suddenly drops away, an ox does not panic. It stops. It waits. It stands there, patient and calm, while men figure out what to do next. This temperament made all the difference in the logging camps. Bull punchers, as the men who drove ox teams were called, developed relationships with their animals that lasted years. A good teamster knew each ox by name, knew its personality, knew exactly how much it could pull, and when it needed rest. These were not interchangeable draft animals. They were partners in a dangerous enterprise. Consider a teamster named John McDonald, who worked the Saginaw Valley operations in Michigan through the 1870s. Camp records from the era mention him repeatedly, always in connection with his lead pair, or animals he had named Duke and General. McDonald had trained these oxen from calves, raised them to respond to his voice alone, and refused to work with any other animals. When Duke finally died of old age in 1879, McDonald reportedly wept openly in front of the entire camp, then took 3 days off work before training a new lead pair. Stories like McDonald's were common, though rarely recorded in detail. The bond between teamster and oxen was understood by everyone in the camps, but considered too ordinary to document. It was simply how the work was done. Oxen were tough in ways that horses could never match. They could survive on rough forage that would starve a horse. They could work in deep mud that would mire a horse to its belly. Their hooves were more durable on rough terrain, and when the work was done, when the ox was too old to pull, it could be slaughtered for beef. Try eating a horse in 19th century America, and you would be treated as something close to a savage. The equipment used to move these massive logs evolved over decades, refined through trial and error and the deaths of countless men and animals. At the heart of the system were the big wheels, and they were exactly what they sound like. Enormous wooden wheels, typically ranging from 10 to 16 feet in diameter, mounted on a heavy axle. The concept was simple. If you cannot lift a 100-ton log onto a wagon, you can at least lift one end of it. The big wheels would be positioned behind the log, and the front end of the log would be chained to the axle between the wheels. When the oxen pulled forward, the log would drag behind, with its front end suspended several feet off the ground and its back end trailing through the dirt. This arrangement solved several problems at once. By lifting the front of the log, you reduce the friction against the ground by roughly half. The massive wheels could roll over stumps and debris that would have stopped a smaller cart, and the height of the wheels meant the axle was high enough to clear obstacles that would have snagged a lower vehicle. Building these wheels was an art unto itself. They had to be strong enough to support loads that would crush ordinary wagon wheels like paper. The spokes were typically made from white oak or hickory, the hardest and most resilient woods available. The felloes, the curved sections of the rim, were steamed and bent into shape, then joined together with iron bands. The tires were not rubber, of course, but iron. Thick bands of forged metal that protected the wooden rim from the constant grinding of rocks and stumps. A single big wheel might weigh 500 pounds. The axle connecting two of them was a solid piece of ochre iron weighing several hundred more. The chains used to bind logs to this apparatus were forged from iron links, each one tested by the men who would bet their lives on them holding. The Silas C. Overpack Company of Manistee, Michigan, became the most famous manufacturer of big wheels during the peak logging years. Their wheels, stamped with the company name, were considered the finest available, and a set of overpack wheels could command prices equivalent to a year's wages for an ordinary worker. Teamsters who drove overpack rigs took pride in the equipment, maintaining it with the same care they gave their animals. And then there were the harnesses. Connecting 20 oxen to a single load was not simply a matter of chaining them together in a line. The harnesses had to distribute the pulling force evenly, had to allow each animal to contribute its strength without interfering with the others. Bull teams were typically arranged in pairs, with a lead pair at the front and a wheel pair directly in front of the load. The pairs in between were called swing teams, and their positioning required constant adjustment based on the terrain and the behavior of individual animals. The yokes that joined each pair of oxen were carved from hardwood, shaped to fit across the necks of two animals without choking them or rubbing their shoulders raw. Good yokes were passed down from one generation of loggers to the next, worn smooth by the necks of dozens of different oxen over decades of use. The best yoke makers could fit a yoke to a specific pair of oxen the way a tailor fits a suit, accounting for differences in neck thickness, shoulder height, and pulling style. The men who drove these teams were among the most skilled workers in the logging camps, and they commanded wages to match. A bull puncher had to understand his animals the way a cavalry officer understood his horse, but he also had to understand engineering, physics, and the unpredictable nature of massive weights moving over rough terrain. Isaac Stevenson, who later became a United States Senator from Wisconsin, started his career as a bull puncher in the Maine woods before the Civil War. In his memoirs, he described the work as requiring constant attention, constant adjustment, constant awareness of everything happening around you. A moment's distraction could mean disaster. A single wrong command could send 100 tons of timber rolling in the wrong direction, crushing everything in its path. The basic technique was called swamping a road, and it involved nothing less than building a temporary highway through virgin forest. Swampers would go ahead of the logging operation, cutting down small trees, filling in low spots with logs and brush, creating a path wide enough for the big wheels to pass. In swampy areas, they would build corduroy roads, laying logs perpendicular to the direction of travel to create a rough but passable surface. These roads were not permanent. They would be used for a single winter's logging, then abandoned to rot back into the forest. But while they were in use, they had to be maintained constantly. A single deep rut could catch a wheel and bring the entire operation to a halt. A hidden stump could shatter an axle. A soft spot could swallow a wheel up to its hub. The work began before dawn. Bull punchers would enter the ox barn while the stars were still visible, feeding their animals, checking harnesses, inspecting hooves for stones or cracks. The oxen knew the routine and would stand patiently as yokes were fitted and chains were attached. By the time the sun cleared the treetops, the first teams would be heading out to where yesterday's sawyers had felled fresh timber. If you could transport yourself back to one of these operations, the sensory experience would overwhelm you. The cold would hit first, a penetrating chill that the loggers' heavy wool clothing could only partially deflect. Then the smell, a mixture of pine resin, wood smoke from the cook shanty, and the warm animal scent of the ox barn. The sounds would come next, the jingling of chains, the creak of leather, the low commands of the teamsters, and beneath it all the heavy breathing of the oxen themselves. At the cutting site, the real work began. The sawyers would have already bucked the fallen tree into manageable sections, cutting the trunk into logs of roughly 40 feet each. These sections still weighed tens of thousands of pounds, and getting them oriented for transport required its own set of techniques. Cant hooks were essential tools, long wooden handles with a pivoting metal hook at one end that could grip the bark of a log and allow a man to roll it. A crew of 6 or 8 men working together with cant hooks could rotate a log into position, but only just barely. The mechanical advantage of these simple tools was the only thing that made the work possible at all. Once a log was positioned, the big wheels would be brought up behind it. The front of the log would be lifted using a combination of levers and the strength of the ox team, then chained to the axle. This was the most dangerous moment of the entire operation. On chains, under tension can snap without warning, and a broken chain whipping through the air can cut a man in half. Log ends can slip, crushing anyone standing too close, and the oxen themselves, despite their calm temperament, could shift unexpectedly under the sudden weight. A man named Patrick Hurley died this way in a camp near Muskegon in 1872. He was standing too close when a chain slipped, and the log end swung around and caught him across the chest. The camp foreman recorded the death in a ledger that still survives. Hurley P. killed by log, buried on site. That was all the memorial he received. The work continued the next day. Men died during these hookups with terrible regularity. They died when chains broke, when logs rolled, when an animal stumbled at the wrong moment. Their names are recorded in camp ledgers if they are recorded at all. Their deaths noted in the same matter-of-fact tone used to record broken equipment and changes in weather. Once the log was secured, the bull puncher would give the command to move. In New England and the upper Midwest, this was typically a shout of G to turn right, haw to turn left, and gidap to move forward. But many bull punchers developed their own vocabularies, personal codes that their animals learned over years of working together. A teamster named Ole Hansen, who worked the Wisconsin woods for 3 decades, was said to speak to his oxen in a mixture of Norwegian and English that no one else in camp could understand, but his animals responded to every word. 20 oxen moving in unison was something like watching a single organism with 40 legs. The lead pair would step forward, and the motion would ripple back through the team as each successive pair felt the tension on their yokes and began to pull. The wooden wheels would groan and begin to turn, and the log, the massive section of ancient tree that had stood in that forest since before the American Revolution, would begin its journey to the river. The pace was agonizingly slow by any modern standard. An ox team hauling a full load might cover 2 miles per hour on good road. less than 1 mile per hour on rough terrain. A single trip from cutting site to riverbank might take an entire day, with the bull puncher walking alongside his team the whole way, watching for obstacles, adjusting the route, talking constantly to his animals in that low, steady voice that kept them calm. And there were so many things that could go wrong. Wheels could break. Despite their massive construction, the big wheels were under constant stress, and a crack in a spoke or a split in a felloe could bring the entire operation to a halt. Camp blacksmiths kept spare parts on hand. But major repairs might require sending to town for materials, a delay of days or even weeks. Animals could be injured. Oxen that stepped in hidden holes could break legs. Oxen that worked too long in cold weather could develop frostbite on their hooves or faces. Oxen that were pushed too hard could simply collapse from exhaustion, lying down in their harnesses and refusing to move no matter how much they were goaded. The yokes themselves, despite careful fitting, wore calluses into the animals' necks over years of use. These calluses thickened until they formed permanent ridges of hardened skin, visible evidence of a lifetime spent under the yoke. Older oxen bore these marks like badges, their necks shaped by decades of hauling impossible loads through impossible terrain. Weather could turn. A sudden thaw in January could turn a solid skid road into a river of mud, impossible to traverse with loaded wheels. A heavy snow could bury the road entirely, and requiring days of work to clear. An extreme cold brought its own dangers, making metal brittle, making hands clumsy, making every task take twice as long. The men themselves broke down. Bull punchers worked 14-hour days, 7 days a week, for months at a stretch. They ate rough food cooked over open fires. They slept in bunkhouses so crowded that men shared bunks in shifts. They faced constant danger from falling trees, shifting loads, panicked animals, and equipment failure. And they did all of this in weather that routinely dropped below zero for weeks at a time. A surviving letter from a logger named James Fitzpatrick to his wife in 1868 describes conditions in stark terms. "The cold is beyond what I knew in Ireland. Men have lost fingers and toes to it. We had a man die last week from a tree falling wrong. The work goes on. Or I think much of you and the children every night, but there is nothing for it but to finish the season and come home with what I have earned." Injuries that would send a modern worker to the hospital were treated in camp with whatever was available. Cuts were stitched by fellow loggers whose medical training consisted of having watched someone else do it once. Broken bones were set by feel and splinted with whatever wood was at hand. Men who lost fingers or toes to frostbite or accidents simply bandaged the stumps and went back to work as soon as they could hold a tool. The survivors of this work were marked by it for the rest of their lives. Missing digits were common. Bent backs from years of heavy labor were universal. Lungs damaged by cold and smoke made breathing difficult. And the memories, the accumulated weight of danger and death and backbreaking work, I stayed with them long after the last tree was cut and the last camp was abandoned. But they kept doing it. Year after year, winter after winter, the ox teams went out and the logs came down to the rivers. The forests of Michigan and Wisconsin were stripped bare over the course of half a century, and the lumber built Chicago after the fire, built Milwaukee, built Detroit, built the farms and fences and bridges of the expanding Midwest. But the routes these logs traveled were engineering marvels in their own right, carved through wilderness by men whose only tools were axes and shovels and the sweat of their own bodies. Skid roads were the arteries of the logging operation, paths through the forest, along which logs could be dragged with minimal resistance. The name itself tells you something about the technique. Logs were not rolled along these roads, but skidded, dragged over the ground with the big wheels lifting only the front end. To reduce friction, the skid roads were constructed with embedded logs running perpendicular to the direction of travel. These cross logs, called skids, were placed every few feet along the road, creating a ribbed surface over which the dragging log end could slide more easily. In winter, when the ground froze and snow fell, water would be sprayed over the skid road at night. This would freeze into a coating of ice, or making the surface even more slippery and reducing the number of oxen needed to pull a load. The men who maintained these ice roads worked through the coldest hours of the night, spraying water from large wooden tanks mounted on sleds. They were called road monkeys, and their work was among the coldest and most miserable in the entire operation. They wore layer upon layer of wool and leather, but the cold still found its way in. Frostbite was an occupational hazard, one as routine as splinters or blisters. Corduroy roads solved a different problem. In swampy areas or locations with soft soil, even the big wheels would sink into the ground and become mired. The solution was to build a temporary surface out of logs laid side by side, their round surfaces providing a rough but solid path over the muck below. Building a corduroy road was brutal work. Trees had to be felled, trimmed, and dragged into position, all by hand and animal power. The logs had to be close enough together that wheels would not drop between them, but not so close that there was no room for adjustment as the logs settled into the mud. A good corduroy road might last for several winters of use, but eventually the logs would rot into the swamp and new ones would have to be laid. Some of these roads stretched for miles, connecting cutting sites deep in the forest to rivers where logs could be floated downstream to sawmills. The investment of labor they represented was staggering. Thousands of man-hours went into building roads that would be used for a few seasons and then abandoned. The Tittabawassee River in Michigan became one of the great log highways of the era, carrying millions of board feet of timber downstream to sawmills at Saginaw Bay each spring. The ox teams that fed this river worked through forests that seemed inexhaustible, by cutting and hauling with an efficiency that only grew as techniques were refined. And yet this was the calculation that made economic sense. Timber was so valuable and the trees so massive that almost any investment in transportation was justified. A single white pine of the first quality might yield lumber worth hundreds of dollars at the mill in an era when a skilled worker earned perhaps $2 per day. The profit margin on each tree easily covered the cost of building roads to reach it, feeding the men and animals who hauled it, and absorbing the losses from accidents and delays. This calculation drove the logging industry westward like a slow-motion invasion. The pine forests of Maine were exhausted by the 1850s. The forests of New York and Pennsylvania followed soon after. Michigan's forests, the richest and most extensive in the eastern half of the continent, began to fall in earnest after the Civil War and were largely gone by 1900. With each westward movement, the techniques of ox-powered logging were refined and adapted. The big wheels got bigger, the teams got larger, the roads got more sophisticated, and the pace of destruction accelerated, driven by the insatiable demand of a growing nation for building materials. By the 1880s, in the logging camps of the Pacific Northwest, were pushing into forests that made even the giant pines of Michigan look modest. The coast redwoods of California, the Douglas firs of Oregon and Washington, these were trees on a scale that challenged everything the eastern loggers thought they knew. A single coast redwood might measure 20 feet across at the base and contain enough lumber to build 40 average houses. Moving such a tree required not 20 oxen, but sometimes 40 or more, yoked in a line stretching 100 feet or more into the forest. The big wheels built to haul these logs were the largest ever constructed, some of them standing 16 feet tall and weighing close to a ton each. Photographs from this era show scenes that seem almost fantastical. Teams of oxen stretching into the forest gloom, their breath steaming in the cool coastal air. Logs so large that men could dance on the cut ends without crowding each other. Wheels so tall that a man could walk underneath the axle without ducking. A photographer named Darius Kinsey made it his life's work to document the logging industry of the Pacific Northwest. His images, now held in archives and museums across the region, provide the most detailed visual record we have of this era. They show the scale of the work in ways that words cannot capture. But it was also in the Pacific Northwest that the age of ox-powered logging began to end. The first steam donkey arrived in the California redwood country in 1881. It was a clumsy thing by later standards, prone to breakdowns and explosions, dangerous to operate and expensive to maintain. But it could drag logs uphill, something essentially impossible with animal power. It could work through mud and snow that would have mired an ox team. It could pull loads heavier than any combination of animals could manage, and it did not need to eat or rest or be replaced when it grew old. John Dolbear, a mechanical-minded lumberman, patented the first commercially successful steam donkey in 1882. His design used a vertical boiler powering a single drum around which a long cable was wound. The cable could be extended into the forest, attached to a log, and then reeled back in, dragging the log toward the machine. The principle was simple, but the implications were enormous. Where an ox team required a clear road to operate, a steam donkey could work from a fixed position, by dragging logs through brush and over obstacles that would have been impassable to animals. Where an ox team needed constant supervision from a skilled teamster, a steam donkey needed only a fireman to keep the boiler fed and an operator to work the controls. Where an ox team was limited by the endurance of living creatures, a steam donkey could work as long as wood and water were available. The danger did not decrease. Steam donkeys killed men with terrible regularity. Boilers exploded when water ran low or pressure built too high. Cables snapped under tension and whipped through the air like deadly whips. Men were crushed by logs moving too fast to avoid. The machines were indifferent to human life in a way that even the most ill-tempered ox was not. But the economics were undeniable. A single steam donkey could do the work of dozens of oxen. The investment paid for itself within seasons, not years. And as the technology improved, and as the machines became more reliable and more powerful, the competitive advantage became overwhelming. The transition was not immediate. Ox teams continued working alongside steam equipment for decades, handling jobs too small or too remote to justify setting up a donkey engine. In some isolated operations, oxen remained the primary power source well into the 20th century. The last commercial ox teams were retired in the 1920s, and a few hobbyist operations continued into the 1930s and even later. But the writing was on the wall from the moment the first steam whistle echoed through the forest. The age of muscle and patience was giving way to the age of fire and steel. What was lost in that transition is difficult to quantify. The speed of the new methods was measured in loads per hour, not in the relationship between a man and his animals. Steam donkeys did not have names. They did not learn over time to respond to a particular voice. They did not give warning when they were tired or when something was wrong. They simply worked until they broke down, then were repaired or replaced. The bull punchers who had spent their lives learning to work with oxen found their skills obsolete. Some of them adapted, learning to operate the new machinery. Others drifted away from the industry entirely, taking their knowledge with them. A few left written accounts of their work, but most did not. They were working men, not writers, and their daily reality seemed too ordinary to them to be worth recording. An old teamster named William McLeod gave an interview to a newspaper in Eureka, California in 1924, just a few years before his death. He had driven oxen in the redwood forests for 35 years, from the 1870s until the steam donkeys finally made his skills unnecessary. "I miss the animals," he told the reporter. "They were better company than most men I knew. And they never complained about the work, not once. They just did what you asked of them until they could not do it anymore." We know the names of very few bull punchers, occasional mentions in camp records, a handful of photographs with faded captions, stories passed down through families and eventually forgotten. The men who moved a continent's worth of timber have largely vanished from historical memory. Their animals fared even worse. The hundreds of thousands of oxen who gave their strength to this work are anonymous in a way that even the lowliest human workers are not. We know that they existed. We know that they were essential. But we do not know their names, do not know their individual stories, do not know which ones were leaders and which ones were followers, which ones were gentle and which ones were stubborn. What we do know is the scale of what they accomplished. In the decades between the Civil War and World War I, American logging operations cut down forests that had taken thousands of years to grow. They floated logs down rivers that had never before seen such traffic. They built roads into wilderness that no European had ever penetrated, and they did much of this work with nothing more than axes, saws, chains, and the patient, steady strength of ox teams. The lumber they produced built the nation. It built the railroad ties that carried trains from coast to coast. It built the frames of houses and barns and factories. It built the scaffolding for bridges and the forms for concrete dams. It built the furniture in which people sat and the coffins in which they were buried. Every board foot of that lumber passed through human hands. Every log was felled by men swinging axes and pulling saws. Every log was moved by animals straining against leather and chain. Yet the connection between raw material and finished product was physical, tangible, unavoidable. That connection is largely severed today. Modern logging is done by machines so large and sophisticated that they make the big wheels look like children's toys. A single harvester can fell, delimb, and buck a tree in under a minute, doing work that would have taken a crew of men all day. The logs are hauled out on trucks that dwarf the largest ox teams. And the men who operate this machinery are protected from the elements, separated from the physical reality of the work by layers of steel and glass and hydraulics. This is progress by any reasonable definition. Fewer men are injured. More lumber is produced. The work is less brutal, less demanding, less likely to leave a man crippled or dead by middle age. But something has been lost as well. The intimacy of working with animals, the relationship between bull puncher and ox team, the sense of shared labor toward a common goal. The knowledge that your work depended not just on machines, but on living creatures who could feel pain and fatigue and loyalty. The understanding that the forest was not just a resource to be extracted, but an environment to be negotiated, respected, survived. The men who drove ox teams through the forests of 19th century America understood something about the cost of progress that we have largely forgotten. They paid that cost with their bodies, with their health, with their lives. They paid it in lost fingers and frozen toes and backs broken by decades of labor. They paid it in loneliness and separation from families and communities, months spent in wilderness camps far from anyone they loved. And the oxen paid it too, in their own way. Animals worked until they could not work anymore, then were slaughtered for their meat and their hides. The industry consumed them just as it consumed the forests, feeding on muscle and bone to produce the lumber that fed the nation's growth. This is not a comfortable story. It does not fit neatly into narratives of progress or triumph or American ingenuity. It is a story of brutal work done by forgotten people and animals, work that made possible the comfortable lives we lead today, but that we rarely acknowledge or remember. The next time you walk across a wooden floor or lean against a wooden fence or sit in a wooden chair, consider for a moment the chain of labor that brought that material into your life. Consider the trees that grew for centuries before being felled. Consider the men who swung the axes and pulled the saws. Consider the oxen who strained against their yokes, step by patient step, moving logs heavier than any modern truck could carry. Consider that all of this happened so long ago that almost no one alive today remembers it directly. The last bull punchers died decades ago. The last working oxen were retired before your grandparents were born. The forests that were stripped bare have regrown into second and third growth timber, looking almost but not quite like the wilderness they once were. But the work endures in the buildings that still stand, in the infrastructure that still serves, in the very bones of the nation that the logging industry helped to build. The debt we owe to those forgotten workers, human and animal alike, Neemkosh is written into the grain of every piece of old-growth lumber that survives from that era. We will never be able to repay that debt. The men are gone, the oxen are gone, even the trees themselves are largely gone, but we can at least acknowledge it, can at least remember that the world we inhabit was built by hands and hooves and muscle, by men and animals who gave everything they had so that we could live as we do. That is the story of how America moved its biggest trees before the machines came. It is a story of impossible tasks accomplished through brute strength and stubborn patience. It is a story of partnership between humans and animals, of mutual dependence and shared suffering. And it is a story that deserves to be remembered, not because it was glorious or triumphant, but because it was real, because it happened, because the people and animals who lived it deserve better than to be forgotten. The big wheels have rotted away, the ox yokes hang in museums or gather dust in antique shops, the skid roads have been swallowed by new forest growth, but somewhere in the grain of an old barn or the frame of a Victorian house, the work of the bull punchers and their teams endures. Silent evidence of an age when moving mountains was done one step at a time, when progress was measured in patience rather than horsepower, when the impossible was accomplished every single day by men and animals whose names we will never know. If you found yourself moved by this history, by this glimpse into a world of work that has vanished almost completely from living memory, then subscribe. Because there are more stories like this one. Stories of forgotten workers and impossible tasks. Stories that deserve to be told before the last traces of them vanish entirely. The forest will not remember the oxen that hauled their fallen trees. The cities built with old-growth lumber do not acknowledge the men who died cutting and moving it. But we can remember, we can honor their labor by at least knowing that it happened, by refusing to let their sacrifice fade into total obscurity. That is the least we can do for those who built the world we inherited, and it is the most important thing we can do to understand the true cost of the progress we take for granted.